first thing that we're going to do is we're going to overlock the long edge of the waistband on the side that has the double notches. So if the side that has the double notches is on the right, you're going to overlock that long side. And how much are you going to overlock? You're just going to try and shave a hair's breadth off. Okay, and that's it. We just overlocked that one side. So now, taking a look at the skirt, we're going to be applying the waistband. And if you look at the back of the sample, you're going to see that on the wearer's right, there is about an inch extension, and on the wearer's left, it's flush with the zipper. So that's how we're going to be doing it, and that's why there are double notches there. Okay? You can take a look at this if you want. Okay, so if we take the skirt, and we look right here and we see that there are double notches, this is the side that's going to have the extension. So we're going to fold this side back so the right sides are together. And what we're going to do is this. Your seam allowance is a 1/2 inch right here, correct? So what you're going to do is you're going to sew down the 1/2 inch, you're going to pivot, and you're going to sew until you're flush with the notch. So you're sewing an L, okay? That's what we're going to do to finish the edge. We're going to just sew an L. So with right sides together, making sure your stitch length and your tension is fine. Remember, just practice your tension a little bit on a scrap of fabric to make sure your stitch is perfect before you sew it on your skirt. Pivot, and then you're going to sew exactly until you're flush with that notch. When you're flush with the notch, you're going to reverse a few stitches, and then we're going to trim it. Okay? Give me those scissors for my day. Use those two. Okay, so now we're going to trim this down, okay? I'm going to angle at the corner. I just angled at the corner, and then I'm going to trim this down to about 1/8 of an inch. And you can trim it pretty closely because it's got fusible interfacing. That's kind of reinforcing it. Then I'm clipping from the notch right up to where I stopped sewing. And then I'm going to trim this seam allowance. Okay? So I've sewn my L and then I've trimmed it. Okay. After you trim it, then what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to reverse this part of the waistband. The little extension, I'm going to just push out. And what I'm going to use to help me push this out, which I will leave on my sewing machine for anybody to use, is a little pointer. They're very useful. And you're going to try and push it out as well as you can. If you find that you haven't trimmed enough, like I could probably trim a little bit more in that corner, so I'm going to just go to the iron and press that flat, okay? And then I'm coming right back. Next step, remember that we overlocked the long edge of the waistband? That's because we're going to pin the waistband along the skirt, and then it's going to get flipped into the inside, okay? But you have notches along this skirt. All along this skirt, you have cut notches into the fabric to help you align the skirt. I'm going to pin the waistband on, and then I am going to baste it. Something else I don't do that often. So I'm matching center back, and then I'm looking for my next notch. And my next notch is going to line up with the side seam. In waistbands, you always, if it's a center back closure, you have a notch for the side seam. You have a notch for, sometimes you have a notch for the center front, which I don't. And then you have, it lines up with center back. There's a notch for center back. And I'm going to look for my side seam notch, which is there. Is very tightly woven. And then we're going to go all the way around to the back, and you have a center back notch that your center back will line up with. Okay? So just to check, you have your center back notch, you have your side seam notch, and you have your side seam notch. Okay? Then I'm going to just divide this in half. And I'm going to pin at my center front. You could put in a notch for your center front as well. There's not one in the pattern. And then the next step is I'm going to baste all along here, okay, to hold it together before I put it under the sewing machine, okay? Opportunity to try to use a thimble, and generally use a thimble on your middle finger. And what it does is it helps you to push the needle through very thick fabrics. Okay? So if you are basting, I just loop the thread through once to not that it knots it, but it just sort of holds it in place. You want to have it so that you can pull your basting thread out really easily. So lining up your raw edges, I am going to baste at around a ½ inch. And I'm just making sure my raw edges are really perfectly lined up. And it's a pretty quick stitch. It's coming out, so I don't really worry about how beautiful it is. And it's just going to hold the waistbands together so that I can sew them and not worry about making sure everything lines up. Okay? So this is a basting stitch, which we're going to do along the whole skirt. Okay, along the whole waistband. So that's it. We're going to sew the waistband on. And here's my suggestion. I would sew from the inside of the skirt. Why? Because you have the stay stitch right along here, and you want to hide the stay stitch. So I'm going to stitch just to the left of the stay stitch, meaning that it's going to hide the stay stitch. Okay? So starting at one end, slowly and carefully, you're going to sew just below the stay stitch, attaching the skirt to the waistband. You could probably move that skirt out of the way somewhere. And the most important thing that you want to focus on right here is that you want to make sure that there are no tucks or gathers that you're sewing in. And you really want to do this accurately. And by basting it on, all you focus on is the stitching. You're not worried about it lining up. You're not worried about holding them together. You got one goal. You also want to make sure when you did your basting that all the darts and everything again are going in. You've attached it with the machine, you can take out your basting thread all along, okay? And this will just, you can break it and pull it out. Okay. The next thing that we're going to do is we need to finish the other end of the waistband. Okay? You have one raw edge. So what we're going to do is this. We're going to fold the waistband back, right sides together. Do you see? We're going to sew just along here, the 1/2 inch or whatever it is. Mine's like 5/8 of an inch, right here. Okay? Everybody with me? Because think about it. You want it to be finished like that. Okay? Take a few stitches, reverse, okay? And then once again, I'm going to trim this seam allowance. So I'm going to, at the corner, I'm going to trim it like at an angle. You always trim your corners at an angle. And then I'm going to take the shorter seam allowance and trim it. But right now, I'm going to leave this seam allowance long. Okay, I can trim it a tiny bit. Because this is what's going to happen. This is going to flip to the inside. I need to trim my threads. We're going to push out the corner. I need to trim a little bit more. And this is going to be the other edge of the skirt. This is going to be the other end. And I just tucked in under the corner a little bit, okay? Then what happens is we're going to stitch from the right side in that crack. It's called stitch in the ditch, and that holds down the waistband. Before I do that, I want to trim my seam allowances a little bit so they're flatter, and I want to press the end of my waistband. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to trim my seam allowance a little bit, and I'm going to do something called grading the seam allowances, which is essentially cutting the seam allowances to different lengths so that what's left is kind of stepped. It's not, you're not cutting them both the same length, so they're ending at different points. Okay? So for the skirt, I'm going to cut it to half of its original width. It was 1/2 inch, it's now 1/4 of an inch. And the waistband, I'm going to cut slightly longer. So I'm cutting about 1/8 of an inch off. So do you see that? The skirt is half its original width, the seam allowance, and the waistband, if the waistband seam allowance was 1/2 inch, it's now 3/8 of an inch. I just cut 1/8 off. So you're going to do that all the way around. After you do that, I'm going to call you back up here, and I'm going to do the next step for the waistband. Okay? Any questions?